Welcome back. Tonight we begin something different. A week we have never walked through together before. The final 7 days of a city whose name has outlived every empire that came after it. We are going back to the year 1184 BC, to the last full day that Troy's greatest general drew breath as a free man defending his home. Using AI recreated imagery, painted reconstructions from centuries of artists who tried to imagine this place, and the archaeological record pulled from the mound at Hisarlik, we are going to walk these streets as they actually stood, hour by hour, through the eyes of the man tradition remembers as Troy's last defender. Before the sun rises over the walls one final time, before the ships in the bay do what they came to do, you are going to meet a city at its most alive, still arguing, still trading, still praying, still utterly unaware of exactly how little time is left. And by the end of this journey, we will stand together on that same hillside in modern Turkey and see, with our own eyes, what remains. Picture him now, this general, standing on a timber balcony overlooking the plain just as the first gray light touches the sea. He has not slept more than a few hours in longer than he can remember. Below him, cook fires are already being coaxed back to life in courtyards, a donkey brays somewhere near the lower gate, and out past the walls, close enough to make out individual tents in clear weather, the enemy camp is stirring too. 10 years is a strange unit of time to hold in your body. It is long enough that children born after the siege began now carry water for soldiers who were boys themselves when it started. This morning, though, feels different, and he cannot yet say why. Long before this general ever buckled on his armor, long before 10 years of siege war grooves into the plain outside the walls, Troy was something far humbler. Archaeologists have found that people were living on this hill above the Dardanelles as early as 3000 BC, in small fortified settlements that historians now number simply as Troy I through Troy IX, layered on top of one another like the rings inside a tree. The earliest villages here were modest clusters of stone and mud brick, home to farmers and fishermen who had chosen this spot for one overwhelming reason: its position. The hill sat almost exactly where the narrow strait later called the Hellespont met the wider sea, meaning every ship moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to pass close enough to be seen, taxed, or traded with. Long before anyone dreamed of towers or golden treasures, the people here were simply toll collectors of geography, growing wealthy on wheat, wool, and the ships that had no choice but to sail past their door. They could not have known that this same advantage of location would one day make their home a prize worth a decade of war. Generation by generation, the settlement thickened. Simple defensive ditches gave way to modest stone footings, then to proper fortification walls, each rebuilding a little more ambitious than the last, as though the people living here sensed, even without words for it, that whatever they were building on this hill was worth protecting. Pottery recovered from these earliest layers shows influence arriving from Anatolia to the east and from the Aegean world to the west, a sign that even in its infancy, this small hilltop community was already a meeting point rather than an isolated village, absorbing ideas and goods from every direction the wind and current allowed. By the time our general was born, Troy had grown into something the earlier villagers never could have imagined. The city that historians now call Troy VII, believed by many researchers to correspond to the Troy of legend, sat behind walls built from massive limestone blocks, some estimated to have stood over 5 meters high and more than 4 meters thick at their base, sloped outward in a way that made scaling them by force nearly impossible. Above the stone base, mud brick and timber upper walls rose still higher, and the whole circuit, roughly 500 meters around, enclosed a citadel of narrow paved lanes, 2-story timber-framed houses, and a royal complex crowning the highest point of the hill. Sound would have been constant, the ring of bronze on stone as masons repaired storm-damaged sections of wall, the creak of ox carts hauling grain up from the lower town, the shouts of merchants near the gates where wool, tin, and worked bronze changed hands in half a dozen languages at once. Even at its height, this was not a finished, polished monument. Excavators have found evidence of hastily reinforced wall sections and makeshift buttressing near the southern gate, believed by some to date to this final period, a sign that the city, even under siege, was still being patched and defended in real time rather than admired from a distance. Inside the citadel, the general would have known every one of these repairs personally, would have walked past the scaffolding near the southern tower dozens of times that week alone, trading a nod with the same stonemasons who had been reinforcing that stretch of wall since midsummer. The upper city smelled of resin and hot bronze, of horses stabled near the royal quarters, of incense drifting up from the temple precinct on the wind. At night, watch fires along the ramparts threw long shadows down into the lower town, and sentries called to one another across the towers in a rhythm so familiar that most residents no longer consciously heard it, the way a person stops hearing the sea after living beside it long enough. At the heart of civic and sacred life stood the temple precinct near the citadel's summit, where priests maintained rites to Athena, protector of the city, and to Apollo, whose favor was invoked before any major undertaking, whether a harvest, a marriage, or a battle. Judgment and disputes were settled not in a separate courthouse but in the open gathering space near the palace gate, where the king or his appointed elders heard grievances between neighbors, merchants, and rival families in full view of the public. Different eras of belief overlapped visibly here, older household shrines tucked into courtyards sitting alongside newer, more formal altars built as the city's wealth and outside contact grew, a physical record of centuries of changing custom layered into the same sacred ground. Priests moved through this precinct with practiced formality, tending small clay lamps that were never allowed to go dark, and offerings of grain, wine, and worked bronze accumulated at the temple thresholds as families sought favor for sons still stationed on the walls. The general himself, tradition suggests, would stop here on his way to the ramparts most mornings, less out of certainty that the gods were listening than out of the simple human need to do something with his fear before facing another day of command. Elders who sat in judgment near the palace gate carried real authority in this society, their decisions on property disputes, marriage contracts, and accusations of theft binding in a way that shaped daily trust between neighbors as much as any wall shaped the city's safety from outside enemies. Down in the streets below the citadel, life moved at a different rhythm entirely. The lower town, larger than once believed and confirmed by later geophysical surveys to extend well beyond the original excavated walls, held a population that many historians estimate may have reached several thousand at the city's peak, a genuinely large settlement for its era. Bakers worked clay ovens before dawn, the smell of barley bread mixing with wood smoke and the sharper tang of the tanneries near the lower gate. Wealthier households employed servants and kept private wells, while poorer families shared communal water sources and lived in single-room dwellings stacked close along narrow lanes barely wide enough for two loaded carts to pass. Children ran messages between workshops. Scribes and traders left behind clay ceilings and inscribed stones, small fragments of an administrative life that shows Troy functioning as a genuine commercial hub, not merely a fortress. Even after 10 years of siege, ordinary routines had not entirely broken down, they had simply adapted. Weavers still worked their looms in courtyard workshops, though wool now arrived in smaller, more irregular shipments than in peacetime. Potters still fired new vessels in kilns near the eastern wall, patching cracked storage jars rather than always making new ones, a small, practical sign of a city stretching its resources further with each passing season. Rumor moved as fast as bread through these streets. Soldiers' half-heard remarks reworked into gossip by the time they reached the well where women gathered each morning, so that by midday the entire lower town often knew, or believed it knew, more than the general himself had been told at dawn. One place in particular carried the city's civic pride more than any other, the harbor and market square just beyond the lower walls, where ships from Cyprus, the Hittite coast, and the Aegean islands unloaded copper, dyed cloth, and painted pottery in a chaos of dialects and haggling. This was where news arrived first, where sailors' stories of storms and distant kings spread through the crowd before the sun had even fully risen, and where, in peacetime, athletic contests and public feasts drew nearly the entire population together in a shared identity as Trojans first, before any family or trade guild loyalty came second. Even now, with the harbor's usual traffic thinned by the long blockade, small fishing boats still slipped along the coastline at dawn, and the market square still filled each morning with whatever could be spared from dwindling stores, dried fish, olives, the last of a season's wine, traded in low voices between people who had learned, after 10 years, exactly how much could be said aloud and how much needed to stay quiet. Older residents still spoke of the great festival games held here in more prosperous years, foot races and chariot displays that once drew visitors from across the Aegean, memories the current generation held on to precisely because they offered proof that peace had existed before and might, however distantly, exist again. Above all this, on the citadel's most commanding terrace, stood the palace tradition assigns to King Priam and his household, a sprawling complex of painted timber columns, hearths inlaid with imported stone, and storerooms said to hold treasures of gold and worked ivory gathered over generations of trade and tribute. Frescoed walls, reconstructed today only through fragments and comparison with related Bronze Age sites, are believed to have shown scenes of hunting, ritual, and royal processions. Here the general himself, tradition holds, kept his own quarters, his wife and young son sleeping only a short walk from where his father the king made the decisions that would determine whether the city lived or died. And yet, however fine the columns or however deep the storerooms of grain and bronze, the coming catastrophe would not distinguish between palace and hovel. Whatever was about to happen to Troy was going to happen to everyone inside these walls, prince and potter alike. The turning point, as later poets and, much later still, archaeologists would come to understand it, did not arrive in a single moment but built across a final, exhausting stretch of days believed to fall around 1184 BC, the traditional date calculated by the ancient scholar Eratosthenes centuries afterward. For years the Achaean fleet had camped on the shore, neither able to take the walls by force nor willing to sail home empty-handed. And this final week, tradition says, brought the war's last and most consequential turn, culminating in the ruse of a great wooden offering left outside the gates after the besieging ships appeared to withdraw. Whether the Trojans that night believed the war was truly over, that the gods had finally granted them peace, or whether some among them, as later storytellers insisted, urged caution and were overruled, we cannot know with certainty. What the archaeological layer known as Troy VIIa does show, unambiguously, is catastrophe. Excavators have found a thick stratum of ash and collapsed mud brick dating to this period, along with scattered human remains left unburied and hastily stockpiled sling stones near the walls. Physical evidence many scholars interpret as the signature of a city that fell suddenly to violence and fire rather than fading slowly through decline. For the general, this particular day, the first of that final week, would have carried none of the certainty we now have looking backward. There was only the ordinary, exhausting calculus of siege command, checking grain stores against the days remaining, rotating exhausted men off the walls for a few hours of sleep, listening to reports from scouts about unusual movement near the enemy ships. Believed to, historians say, is the only honest way to describe what happened next in this story, because the accounts that survive come to us generations later, shaped by poets working from oral memory rather than eyewitnesses writing in the moment. What we can say with confidence is that whatever the general believed as he closed his eyes that first night of the week, rest was not something the coming days would offer him again. In the years immediately afterward, the hill at Hisarlik did not stay empty for long, though the grand city it had been did not return. Smaller, poorer settlements rose intermittently over the ruins across the following centuries, their inhabitants likely unaware, or only dimly aware through oral memory, of the scale of what had once stood beneath their feet. Over time, the specific memory of Troy drifted from history into legend, kept alive not by records but by poets, until for many later Greeks and Romans the city became less a place that had existed than a story about human pride, war, and loss. That began to change in the 19th century, when the amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, convinced the legendary city was real, began digging at this exact hill in the 1870s. What he and later, more careful excavators uncovered astonished the world. 9 distinct cities stacked one atop another, weapons, jewelry, and household objects frozen in place by fire and collapse, and eventually the burned layer of Troy VIIa itself, offering physical confirmation that a real, fortified, cosmopolitan city had stood here and had indeed met a violent end at roughly the time legend remembered. It is worth pausing on what that really means. Beneath these layers of ash were not abstractions. They were kitchens where someone ground grain that morning. They were thresholds worn smooth by feet that had crossed them 10,000 times without a second thought. Every wall we examine today was once simply someone's wall, home to arguments, laughter, and ordinary mornings that no one there thought to record, because why would they? It was just their life. A general once walked this exact ground worrying about grain and sleep and his family, long before he became a name in a story told and retold for 3,000 years. Today, the hill at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey welcomes visitors who can walk the excavated trenches and see the massive stone fortification walls still standing in places, weathered but unmistakably real beneath the modern sky. The famous ramp near the southern gate, believed by many to be the very entrance described in ancient poetry, remains visible and walkable. Little survives of the painted palace interiors, their fragments now preserved and studied in museum collections rather than standing in place. But the layered trenches themselves, cut deep into the mound by generations of archaeologists, let visitors see with their own eyes the 9 cities stacked one upon another, a physical timeline of 3,000 years. A large wooden horse structure, built for tourists rather than history, stands near the site entrance, a modern nod to the story that first drew the world's attention here. And each summer, sunlight still falls across the Trojan plain and out toward the strait, the same geography that made this hill worth fighting for in the first place, still visibly, unmistakably, the reason any of this happened at all. Near the excavation's eastern edge, information panels now walk visitors through each layer Schliemann and later archaeologists uncovered, translating 3,000 years of rebuilding into something a modern traveler can trace with a single afternoon's walk. Standing at the highest point of the mound, looking out toward the same strait that once justified a decade of siege, it becomes strikingly easy to understand why this hill, of all the hills along this coastline, was the one worth everything to hold. That's where we'll leave things for today, standing at the base of that ancient ramp with the whole plain spread out below us. Thank you so much for joining me on this first day of Troy's last week. I've wanted to tell this story properly for a long time. If there's a place, an era, or an event from history you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and a lot of our best trips have started that way. See you soon for day 2.